My name's Paul Gerard. Welcome to the webinar. I'm here to talk about Agile test strategy today. And really trying to articulate the way perhaps that we should think about strategy in a similar way that we would for what you might recognize as larger, structured projects. But strategy in an Agile team, and a smaller team usually, we have to be careful not to burden the team with too much bureaucracy, of course, and to still align with the Agile principles of speed and autonomy and kind of control over their own destiny. So let me just show you like an overview of what we'll talk about for the next 40 minutes or so. I need to explain what I mean by Agile test strategy and describe what it means, to implement a way of thinking. And I have to say that I think test strategy is more a way of thinking than it is about writing documents that no one ever reads. In order to do this, I'll introduce two ideas that I think I've mentioned before in other sessions, certainly on the conference circuit. One is project profiling, which is to take a view on the shape of the project you have in front of you and to have some prepared statements, if you like. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not about copy and editing templates off the shelf, but profiling is a bit like using checklists to drive your thinking down a certain path. Not to have a closed mind, but simply to take some shortcuts in the thinking. Now, the other way I'd like to introduce the way of thinking about strategy in Agile projects is to regard the Agile test activities as interventions. And this is kind of helpful if you think about it in Agile, because unlike waterfall projects, it's not like you have test stages that are very strict in terms of entry and exit criteria and the behaviors that flow from that. Testing, development, requirements are all kind of continuous activities. They flow rather than are staged. And so I think it's convenient to think of the Agile test activities as interventions, and this is the way I'll present the thinking. I have to obviously mention automation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today because I've covered automation in other webinars, and you could spend days just on the automation piece, of course. But I will just cover briefly the thinking that goes into that style of behaviors. I'll look at what's left, because clearly we're not going to create a very large-scale, comprehensive test strategy in 40 minutes. So I need to look at what I'm not talking about, if you like, what's left. I'll summarize, and then hopefully there'll be a few questions, and I can give you some opinions on the back of those. So firstly, let me suggest that Agile test strategy, it's a bit of an oxymoron, because strategy seems to be more about, in most people's thinking, more about large-scale decision-making ahead of time, which is counter to the thinking of Agile teams that really choose what they do from day to day. So although it's an oxymoron in principle, I think in practice it's not. If you think of strategy as a thought process, I think things become a little bit clearer. So what do I mean by Agile test strategy? Well, there's a bit of ambiguity in the title, and it wasn't deliberate, but it certainly made me think once I got started with the PowerPoint. You could look at it as an Agile way of creating a test strategy for any project. So there's a notion of agility in the process of creating a test strategy for any project, structured or Agile. And that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is, of course, a test strategy for an Agile project. How do we create that? And in effect, what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is talk about an Agile way of creating a test strategy, but the strategy I'm going to talk about will be one for an Agile project. So I'll look at both aspects, if that makes sense. If you Google Agile test strategy, which if you're ever presenting anything, it's convenient to just see what other people say about the topic that you're going to present. There are plenty of recipes out there, not hundreds, but there are maybe 2 or 3 pages of Google finds on Agile test strategy. I have to say most of them offer lists of techniques and behaviors and methods, if you like, but there's not much guidance on how to blend these into an overall strategy. So what we really need is not just a list of things we could do in our testing, but we need to know how to make choices, how to blend a set of test activities into our Agile team to deliver what the team, to the team's goal. Now, I've already said that strategy is a thought process, not a document. So that's not to say that you never document or that you always document a strategy. I think the principle must be that it's documentation with purpose. So you might document the ideas of a strategy for reuse, of course, or you might just sketch them on a whiteboard or distribute them in a note for everybody or put it on your wiki, or you may have to capture the strategy for the record. Literally the project needs to capture its decision-making process. I'm not here to tell you how to capture the knowledge that you would call the test strategy, but it's clear that you have to make that decision yourself and align it with the goals of your team and your project and maybe your organization as a whole. One brief mention of governance. I talked about Agile governance last week in a webinar, and I just want to reproduce the definition that I picked out there. I used Wikipedia. Again, it's a source I quite like to use, but I never trust strictly. But governance is the act of governing, not very helpful. It relates to decisions that define expectations, grant power, or verify performance. Now, I like that definition because it summarizes the three activities of the parent company or parent project that owns the Agile team's behavior and outcomes, if you like. And the two aspects I want to sort of highlight really is the first one, the define expectation. Well, this is the definition of the need, the definition of the requirement, if you like. Okay, and testing has a big contribution to make in the assurance of the understanding, the knowledge required to build software. And the third aspect is this concept of verifying performance. Now that sounds like terribly formal, but what I want to call that is the assurance of the solution. That is the test activities geared towards demonstrating that the goals that have been set for the Agile team are achieved, that the delivered software meets its goals, and the team as a whole behave the way that the parent organization, the governing body, if you like, the way that the governing body require the team to behave. So assurance is primarily the solution, but it's also of the behavior and the performance of the team. Now, just to step back into a bit of theory with strategies in general, is a strategy really captures a set of thinking, thought processes, and in effect, a strategy helps you to decide what to do. And in some cases, the strategy can tell you what to do ahead of time. Some decisions can be made ahead of time. You will decide to implement a rigorous instant tracking process, or you may decide not to. So some strategy statements identify decisions that can be made ahead of time, choices that can be made. Now, sometimes there isn't sufficient information to make those choices today, but what the strategy provides is the process or method or the information that will allow those decisions to be made in the project, those choices to be made, in situ, if you like, within the team. Now, sometimes there is simply not enough information at all to make any choices or even to define the method. But the third aspect of the strategy could be it sets out some principles or maybe a process, but to follow in uncertain situations or to deal with unplanned events. Now, if you look at a waterfall or a structured team, most of the questions that a strategy must answer can be answered ahead of time. So it's kind of the style A, and in effect the idea there would be you'll be ready for anything. There will be nothing unexpected. Of course, that's kind of never true, but the principle is that you try and make all your decisions ahead of time before you embark on the project itself. But in an Agile team, you might have some ready-made policies, but the principle must be that you have to scope and adapt, and really it's the principles that drive your choices made in project. Okay, so if you like, the strategy for an Agile team is more about setting out the principles and key interventions, which is the phrase I'm going to use. Again, just on the general test strategy note, test strategy sort of has tentacles all over the place. There are the project or program goals and risks. There are what I would call constraints, which to do with contract and resource and time tables and environments, skills and so on. You have artifacts, you have opportunities, to do early testing, to improve communications, to involve users early. I've also included the red blob at the top is axioms, this concept of test axioms. So again, that's lifted straight from the tester's pocketbook. So the tester's pocketbook is, as far as I'm concerned, a way of asking or a way of triggering germane questions to make choices in your test strategy. Now, the axioms in the pocketbook, I would still argue, are appropriate for agile projects as much as structured or waterfall. But there's a lot of them, and potentially a lot of them are not relevant to you because of the nature of agility, if you like. But I would still argue that they are worth considering. But that's kind of the picture of test strategy as a whole, which is quite a complex process to derive a test strategy. And let me compare and contrast the two. So traditional test strategy, typically you would identify the testing stakeholders. What do they want from the testing in a project? You'd identify the goals and how the testing will demonstrate achievement of those goals. We might do a product risk analysis. So we'd look at the nature of the way that a system can fail as you build it and as you deliver it and it is implemented. And we'll assign risks and goals to test stages to either address risks or to demonstrate achievement. And each test stage would then have a more detailed definition describing things like entry and exit criteria, environments, tools, responsibilities, sign-offs, and all that kind of stuff that you need in a more structured or more documentation-driven environment. Now compare that with an agile test strategy. Our argument is that it is more interventionist, which sounds a negative, but what I mean is rather than focus on the goals and risks and stakeholders, whatever, we look at activities embedded within the agile process and highlight where testing could make a contribution and then choose what that contribution is. So the way I'm going to present this is to look at how we can profile a project to, if you like, make choices overall on the testing theme and the nature of the agile or waterfall process. I want to look at the testing interventions that you could implement within your agile process, and then maybe think a little bit about policy that overlays the process, that catches the exceptions, that looks at the gaps, if you like, in the thinking. So let me talk about project profiling for a few minutes. I'm going to use an example from a project that's an assignment with a government client that we undertook a couple of years ago that if you like, is a good case study for me to explain. So I'm not going to explain this in theoretical terms, but literally to walk through a case study. And because it was a government client, they were very particular and they're quite risk averse, naturally. So although they had agile projects, they also had hybrid kind of projects and as well as small but structured waterfall projects. So the profiling the profiler that we created on their behalf help them to select the approach they should take for the project overall, but more specifically the strategy for testing. Now let me just put a caveat on this. I mean, it sounds like I'm drifting in towards providing a template where you simply fill in the gaps and press a button and out pops a strategy which nobody reads. That's not what we're talking about. Although we do have templates, the templates are more intelligent than that in that they do provide prepared text, but as often as not, they provide a set of questions to ask. They don't provide the answers, so they simply draw you further into the mode of inquiry you need to adopt to derive a strategy. The profiler that we created, you don't actually need to write a document to capture the strategy. The purpose of the profiler is simply to eliminate the irrelevant and to focus your attention on the things that matter. Now, it may be that your company policy, and in the example of this government client we had, their policy was to capture the strategy in a document which was change controlled and presented as part of an overall regime which was a Prince 2 regime. Now that's certainly not what all organizations need to do or choose to do. in this context, in the context of the case study, that was the case. But that's not mandatory. That's not necessarily the way that you need to go with this. If you think about it, profilers really are just checklists. They're just guidelines to help you to make choices and to identify where the trade-offs are. So it's not template driven, it's more questioning driven. So the process overall, and I'm going to not talk about this for any length of time, is there was in this case study, the organization had a governing board. They operated a Prince 2 regime, and the board would initiate a project, and the way that it worked in this context was there was a project manager and an assurance manager who worked across many projects, who basically acted as a consultant. So they were really a super test manager, if you like, although they didn't manage a test team. They used the profiler, and part of the profiler that we created actually included a risk assessment profiler as well. The outcome of that was certainly an identification of scope, the test plan items, and risks. So these were at the highest level, so you might call these epics in an agile environment. The product risks were selected from typical modes of failure that had been accumulated over several years. So this was a risk register which you would choose to say, these are the ones that are relevant, these are irrelevant, these need changing, and so on. Now the outcome was a decision on the style of project to be undertaken. And I've color-coded them, and I'm not going to tell you what they are yet, but cerise, orange, green, these had no specific meanings. We just chose to use colors so as not to influence too strongly the thinking that was going into the choices that were being made. Blue, aspects of the profiling that were blue, these were not enough information is known. So these were dangerous. This was dangerous territory and uncertainties. They were taken back to project boards to look further into how they would be addressed. The outcome of the process was a waterfall or a structured test strategy, and cerise was waterfall, orange and green were the Scrum, in this case Scrum approaches. The output was also injected into a project plan for consideration there. And there were other aspects. So some content was templated, but other standard policies like incident tracking, the tools that were in use, a guideline to the creation of stories, Gherkin in effect, and test environments. These things were already available off the shelf. So they weren't part of the strategy, they were referenced by it. So the project profiler helped the project manager to select a project style that fitted the project itself. So it wasn't like, this is a waterfall project, this is an agile project. It was, this is a project, which pathway should we take, and the outcome of which test activities should we incorporate into our projects. The project profiling process had, what does it say here? I guess 6 stages. You had to, the first one was to have the information you need to hand. It was basically a questionnaire. So the profile asked you questions relating to the nature of the project itself. Beyond that, the generic risk profiler identified some generic risks, and you had to make choices on the scale or the criticality on that. And so set definitions were presented, and you made your choice, usually from 4 alternatives. Then there were the product risk profiler, which were specific to do with the technologies in effect. And then there were outcomes that you ought to take the profiling activity further. I can't go into that level of detail, not in this session here, but the principle was that you answered a questionnaire. And here is the start of the profiler, just to give you a flavor of how this worked. Now this is for one organization, customized for their purposes to fit the way they wanted their teams to behave. This is not generic to the degree that it could be used in any company, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of how it worked. So in effect, what the profiler was like a multiple choice questionnaire. And in effect, for each project aspect down the left-hand side, the first one being responsibility for acceptance, the project manager and the assurance manager would together make a choice of which was, what situation were they in. So reading along the top on the first row, you've got users will take responsibility for UAT. They have UAT experiments. So it sounds like the business understand how to manage the acceptance process. The orange column was user will be responsible for UAT but have no test experience. Okay, so they are responsible, but they are not yet trained, if you like. They're not competent, if you like. The green column, users will take part in UAT or witness tests at critical periods and will review the outcome. Again, slightly less engaged. And the blue area, users are unwilling or unable to take part in UAT, reluctant to make the acceptance decision, or not known. It's just not clear how this is going to work. So the blue column is the don't know. Okay, so if you imagine if the project manager and the assurance manager filled in, made choices on this table, you'd get some kind of profile. So in this case, and this is an example, most of the answers are in the green column. Okay, so that's the style of project. And the outliers I've put in red because they clearly don't fit that pattern. So it looks like requirement stability. It looks like although the green column is actually a small agile team, it's a small project, probably an accountable small team can take on this kind of project. It looks like the requirement stability, requirements are actually more stable, so potentially there could be a requirements document injected into this agile team. Now that may make the team not agile, or it may be something that's not acceptable to the user community. They do want to implement requirements in an iterative way, but with larger increments perhaps. That's potentially there. At the bottom right you can see external dependencies. In this case the dependency on external suppliers is not understood. So there's a huge risk there in terms of what the relationship of a team that undertook this project would be with outside suppliers. So the blue column is really go and find out more information. You don't know enough to make a choice in the project. Now the cerise, orange, green columns reflect three styles of project. And this is what they are summarized. So cerise was basically a waterfall. Orange was a formal Scrum approach, probably a slightly larger team. There would be dedicated BA and tester roles and so on. The green project style was again using Scrum, but not in a formal structured way, if you like. There wouldn't be a dedicated BA and there wouldn't be a dedicated tester. The team itself would have to find those skills internally. So the team, obviously, the team definition, the team, the people in the team need to find those skills amongst themselves. And the blue column describes statements that are uncertain, more information required. Now, I'm not going to go any further with the profiler, but the documentation that we provided led people down the thought process of making choices within each project style. Now I want to step back and look at the test activities as interventions. So I'm again using the same case study, and they were using Prince overall, but they were adopting Scrum and Sprints and so on in their project descriptions. And we identified 8 interventions. There are actually 9, but the 9th one was non-functional and pre-production testing, which was optional depending on the project context. These were the core 8 activities. And you can see some of them, numbers 1 and 2, 7 and 8, are project level test activities, and 3, 4, 5 and 6 take place internal to the sprint itself. And I'm going to walk through these just very quickly, just to give you a sense of how we presented this. Now here's quite a complicated diagram, but the 3 rectangles at the center of the page, in effect, are 3 sequential sprints or iterations. And for each, if you look at sprint 1, the first vertical, you can see on entry there is a sprint backlog inside the box, and outside there is the project backlog, if you like. And then there is a choice in this sprint to implement certain stories, and the flow is from top to bottom within that rectangle. So there will be a development activity, there will be some new code delivered, and there will be some integration into the existing code base. So the first sprint is the first delivery. There is no integration other than to implement it into another environment. The second, there is a second batch of software to be integrated with the first, and the third one, and so on. Now outside those 3 sprints, we have some activities, and I'm going to talk about numbers 1, 2, 7 and 8. These are the project level activities. So the first one would be story challenge, what we call story challenge. So this is where, before a story is entered onto the backlog at all, the tester will challenge it. They will create scenarios or acceptance criteria, if you like, to example the story, to challenge whether it is well enough understood to be incorporated into the project. So it's like a first pass test of the knowledge required to build software. The second one is story definition. So within, as the story is introduced into the sprint, in the sprint planning session, if you like, the tester would choose to example or illustrate features described in stories in more detail, in enough detail to say whether it could be estimated, whether it could be tested, whether it could be reasonably integrated into a piece of work to be delivered. So story definition is a refinement of the requirement, a refinement of the stories in particular. The 7th activity at the end of the sprint is a system test. And again, the scope of system testing as you go from left to right increases because it would incorporate more and more regression testing and incorporation of some new functionality added to the existing code base. And the last one was user testing. And again, the scope of it is the same as system testing. So initially just one delivery, but incremental deliveries which are added to the code base on the back of some form of regression testing. So system and user testing were kind of fairly traditional in this context here. So let's look at activities in the sprint itself. So here we have these kind of 2 circles, the Scrum image of a 24-hour cycle and then the sprint cycle itself, 2, 3, 4 weeks. The daily stand-up, that's an intervention in that the tester might report bugs found or stories that are questionable, changes that are causing concern, raising risks and issues, if you like, in front of the team to challenge the team and say, well, are we on top of this? Have we missed anything? Story refinement inside the project itself, inside the iteration, working with the developers and BAs if they're involved, to refine the story as lessons are learned through the development activity, through the tester creating scenarios and defining test, and so on. So the refinement, the refinements may or may not be necessary, but that activity exists as an intervention in the sprint itself to refine the content of stories should the need arise. And the refinement really is about the tester challenging the team. Do we understand this requirement well enough? The next one, developer testing. So I haven't sort of suggested there's a choice yet been made on whether the team is doing behavior-driven development or TDD or anything of that nature. But the developer testing is the point where the developer makes design choices on how to demonstrate compliance to the story, to the requirement, if you like, and to find bugs, and to gain confidence that the component or that the features they're building are reusable in the context of the bigger system. Integration testing likely is to bring the code into the continuous integration environment, to align it with the regular hourly, daily, weekly test automation regime, and to check it into the code library so that it becomes part of the delivered product. Now those are the 8 activities that we identified in this Scrum environment, and for each of those activities we wrote a definition of that activity, that intervention. So the one I've chosen to example here is the story refinement piece. So this is the on entry into the sprint, the story is refined into it's clarified, and a full set of scenarios or acceptance criteria are created for the feature for the testing. Now what you might notice is the responsibilities row, which describes who does what, if you like. There's an orange and a green choice, and depending on the style of project you had, you would delete one of those rows. If you're in the orange style project, you can see there are specific roles for the tester, developers, a product owner or analyst. The product owner approves changes and so on, and the Scrum Master has a contribution to make as well. If you're in the green project, it doesn't happen. So the choice you make on the basis of the profiler reflects what parts of the prepared strategy, if you like, the prepared activity definitions that you reuse. Now in this context, there was a choice between the orange and green rows. The orange projects are more formal, better resourced, slightly larger agile teams. The green projects were more oriented towards having 2 or 3 people in the team, very small teams. Okay, so let me talk about automation briefly. It's not sensible to exclude automation from your test strategy, of course, but I just want to make some comments which are probably quite well understood out there in the Agile world now with respect to where automation fits. And Brian Marick's testing quadrant is very helpful here in that it does set the scene for the choices you need to make about where you do use automation, where you do manual testing, and so on. Essentially, the 4 quadrants, if you look left and right, to the left we have tests that support the team. So these are basically developer, component, or unit testing, and the story-based testing, the feature-based testing that an embedded tester would undertake within the context of the team. To the right, we have the tests that critique the product. So these are more oriented towards exploration and usability, things that naturally are probably not automated as easily, the top right. Excuse me. Looking from top to bottom, we have business-facing tests, tests that might use the user interface in particular, and then the technology-facing tests oriented towards the developer, component, unit testing, of course, but also tests that require automation of some sort. So the performance and load, clearly, and security, and other checking processes that can be done on the technology itself. So obviously the automation tends to be focused on the left-hand side and the bottom left in particular. The bottom right is the non-functional stuff. Top right is the manual user testing or exploratory testing done by independent testers. Now one of the aspects of automation is like at what level do we automate? And again, I'm just presenting just to help the thinking here is to look at the quantity of automation and maybe the quantity of testing in general is increasingly focused on the lower levels, the developer testing. And I think the way that Agile and software development in general is going is to push more of the checking at the low level, feature, component, unit level, to push more and more of that down to the developers for them to do in an automated way, and to encourage them to do test-driven and to capture automated tests as they develop the software. So the pyramid that we have here, the bottom level are your unit or component tests. The bulk of tests in the program, the project as a whole, will be automated at that level. Now some tests don't test individual components, they test more like services. So at this level there is still a programmer's interface, an API, but these are service level rather than low level components. So you might be testing controllers that deliver content to web pages or mobile devices, but you're testing the service rather than the user interface itself. At the top levels you've got the GUI tests, which are historically where system testers have paid a lot of attention and bought a lot of software products and ended up with a lot of shelfware. The GUI tests are the least easy to implement using automation. I'm not going to dwell on this. I talked about this last week and a few weeks ago in other webinars. But the principle is that you try and push as much feature level checking down to the developers. And this is just an illustration of where you might automate. So the top left, you've got the tests that might be driven through stories and maybe a GUI test framework or another robot framework or something similar, perhaps driving a tool through the user interface. Top right, you've got a unit test framework which might drive web pages, for example, directly. Bottom right, you've got like a unit test framework that might drive objects that reside on servers themselves. Okay, so you're not going across an intranet or a network in order to access the application server. So this doesn't add an awful lot of value, but this is really just to illustrate that all architectures have opportunities for automation at multiple levels. Now, one of the things I want to promote, through test strategy, and we do this in general, is we have this concept of requirements validation using stories. So we use the content and the examples from business stories to validate requirements. We can reuse those scenarios to drive acceptance test-driven or behavior-driven and test-driven processes within the development team. But these tests support good design of software, but they also, as an outcome, become an anti-regression tactic. That is, they become, as in an automation regime, continuous integration, they become an anti-regression tactic. Now, automated tests don't replicate manual tests. So the way that developers implement a continuous integration regime and that acceptance tests, all tests that are automated can be put into that CI regime, you shouldn't think of them as re-demonstrating that developed functionality works the way it's specified. That's not the way to think about it. Think of it as a tripwire, that if something changes to disturb the behavior of the software, it triggers an alarm. Now, in order, with that as the goal, you don't necessarily need as many tests automated. You don't necessarily need tests at the user interface level automated. If you think of it as an alarm, as a tripwire, as an anti-regression tactic rather than a mechanistic, we must automate all tests and have them running for all time attitude, this way of distributing the testing from stories through to the continuous integration regime, this, I think, is the more modern way of thinking about testing in Agile teams and in teams in general as well. Now, one thing I've mentioned quite a lot of is this notion of creating scenarios or examples. Each of the interventions that we've mentioned earlier on that involves testers looking at scenarios, they have different purposes. So we might create scenarios to understand the scope of the feature, and this might happen in the story challenge activity, to get stakeholders to accept enough tests to demonstrate acceptability. That might be in story refinement, to validate the requirement in story definition, to estimate the work in iteration planning, and so on. So we use examples to challenge our understanding of the requirement, but also to define tests to be used later on. Scenarios are created to meet several goals, and this is one of the principles, I think, of the story-based development approach that we promote now. So with all that, what's left to think about in terms of strategy? Well, we haven't talked about definitions, for example, of what it means to be done. This challenges all Agile teams. We need to understand what we mean by done in this context, and all the other language that we use in our test strategy. We might incorporate an incident management process for system and acceptance tests, but not developer tests and exploratory testing done by embedded testers in the team. So the choice of scope of incident management might be more refined. Obviously, the automation we use, the format of the content that we use to capture requirements, Gherkin is the obvious choice for business stories. There might be a process of environment request and management, or it might be very simple. It might be very complicated. It depends on the context, of course. There might be a policy for regression testing, and at what levels, and the mechanism for choosing tests that become part of a regression test regime. And then there's the, what do testers actually deliver? Do they deliver documentation in volume, or do we just expect behaviors from them and not content? It's perfectly feasible to capture bugs verbally. when the developer and tester are working very closely, perhaps as a pair. So the strategy needs to identify how we communicate amongst the team and what the testers do to provide their assurance knowledge, if you like. Now I want to spend a little time on organization and just to set the scene, this concept of three amigos. We have the BA, the developer, and the tester. They have different roles within the team. Now, don't get me wrong, these aren't necessarily people, these are roles. So it could be there are two people who take on the three roles. There could be a team of 7 with a dedicated BA, several developers, and maybe 2 testers. I'm not arguing that these are people, but these are roles. What is the role of the tester? I want to suggest that mostly they challenge the thinking that's going on in the project. They challenge people's understanding of the goals and whether risky activities have been highlighted and mitigated. And in effect, they kind of perform assurance in the small. And we've used the term test master to relate to this kind of role. What's the tester's contribution to the testing? Well, fill in the blanks. I'm not here to tell you exactly what the tester does, but the choices you have to make is where dedicated testers' behaviors might contribute to all of these activities. They might write the features or story acceptance criteria. They might collaborate. They might review them. They might write tests for the developers to use for their test-driven behaviors, or they might simply pair with them and just make comment, and so on. You have to choose what the level of contribution is, and the scope is from the lowest level of detail, I would argue, through to system integration outside the Agile team. There's also the notion of liaison with other testers outside the project as well. So the scope is broader than the project, but also the communications, that you are the channel, the conduit to other teams of testers. You have to fill in the blanks and negotiate. So let me close. We are arguing that it is possible to have an Agile test strategy. It does not, and probably doesn't have to be, and probably will not be a large document. The potential is there to create large documents, but I think that's not what we are arguing. It's documentation with purpose. We would argue that you have to use a principled approach to deal with the unexpected. So that is, it's not that you can predict ahead of time all the behaviors that you want in your Agile team. I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can document that to the nth degree and capture that as an understood way of working. More likely, you have to adopt some principles which influence the behavior and force the thinking down certain paths that meet the needs of the project, the owning, the governing program as a whole. We think project profiling can help you to arrive at choices in your test strategy. They are simply a shortcut. They are a heuristic checklist. They're as simple as that. If you think of testing as an intervention rather than test phases, it doesn't draw you into thinking that testing has to be a block on progress. Testing is about understanding the level of achievement and risk within your projects. So in just the same way that a navigator does not set a course at the start of a flight and then tell the pilot we've arrived at the end of the flight, the navigator is having a continuous conversation with the people on the flight deck. In the same way, the testers or the testing role are continuously reassessing where the iteration, the project as a whole is. What goals are being achieved, what risks have been mitigated. Now, test automation is, again, it's very hard to make black and white statements about test automation strategy, and certainly in this talk. But you have to see it in terms of not just what testers do, but in the context of what developers need to do good software design. That is the test-driven approach. There is the behavior-driven approach, which drives the functionality through the developer activity. And then there's the acceptance notion and system testing and so on. You have to look at automation in the context of all these activities as something that the team as a whole do rather than just the testers. Okay, so I'm I'm done, I think. That's about 45 minutes, I think. So I just need to take a look and see what questions are out there, and I'll do my best to answer them. If you want to drop one in now, please do, and I'll try and pick it up before we part company. And the inevitable, will the slides be available? Certainly, we're recording the session. In the next 48 hours, we'll put a video of the session on the internet. If you want the slides, drop me a note, and I'm happy to send you a copy of them. No problem at all there. Let's see what else is there. Question about the profiler. We talked a lot about it. Have we released a version of the profiler? The short answer is no. It's one of these choices. It's not because of commercial considerations. It's not that we think this is a massively valuable asset we cannot share with people. That's not the way I think about it at all. It's just that the profiler itself is a custom-built questionnaire for a client who has very specific goals and requirements for ways of working within its organization. Now, to release a version of the profiler to the general public, I think would give a very skewed vision of how these profilers work. The whole point of them is for the organization as a whole to think through how it wants its teams to behave, how it wants its teams to measure or capture achievement and distribute that knowledge internally to the project and to the outside world. So we're very reluctant to release that because partly it would be misleading, and partly they're quite often company specific and kind of commercially sensitive, so we're kind of reluctant to do that. Perhaps we could capture the process of creating one, but actually the process of creating one is pretty straightforward. So if you're interested in this profiling activity, maybe just drop me a line, and maybe we should talk. Maybe we could build one for you. That's obviously the commercial pitch on it. What was the significance, another question, what was the significance of the colours, cerise, green, blue, and so on? None whatsoever. We could have called them, rather than colours, we could have said they are waterfall, Scrum with some formality, informal Scrum, and then you're in trouble. You need to get to the bottom of this. The colours themselves had no meaning, but they did relate to project pathways, is the way I would put it. We had a waterfall test strategy which would be used to drive the thinking down that path, and then we had a single Agile Scrum-based test strategy, but with variations internal to the document, where you made choices and it asked questions that you basically had to answer in order to complete the thinking for the strategy. So the colours themselves had no meaning. They did reflect choices of project types. I mentioned one last one. I did mention generic and specific product risk profiles. The generic risks were things like I have to remember. So there were a list in the example, in the case study I mentioned. There was a choice of risks that you're presented with, and you could either discard them or use them or amend them to suit your particular context. But essentially, they were about things like supplier relationships being good or bad, the technology in general, whether it was a new technology or one that you've used and you trust. And then the product risk register was a bit like the contents of, for example, the risk-based e-business testing book I wrote with Neil Thompson some years ago. We captured, I think it was about 75 generic modes of failure in web applications. And these generic lists of risks, these checklists, in effect, you make a choice on which ones are relevant, which ones are not relevant, which ones are significant in your projects, and which ones are less significant. So you make choices on the nature of the testing of the risks that you need to demonstrate a mitigation for. So these risk registers, again, you can do some aspects that are generic, but actually it depends on the technology you have and the general working environment that you have in your organization. Oh gosh, a whole lot of projects have come in now. Just let me, questions rather. Let me. I'm trying to expand it. I can't see the. So one moment. Excellent. There we go. What is the role of a test manager on an Agile project? Well, that's an interesting one. In the context of the case study I've just talked about, this was a government organisation, and their choice was not to have a test manager embedded in the Agile team, but rather to have testers who basically self-managed, but they had a dotted line, report line to what was called an assurance manager. So in effect, it wasn't a huge organisation, I have to say, and I think there were maybe a dozen testers reporting through to this assurance manager who was accountable for testing across all the projects. So in this case, the assurance manager basically managed resources, allocated testers to teams, and quite often testers were split across multiple teams. So the projects themselves were not huge, and the team itself was rather kind of matrix managed across multiple projects. So there was less day-to-day running a test team, more of managing resources across teams and getting people training. And there was we also had a, if you like, a testers interest group within the company. And there was a weekly meeting of all the testers to share knowledge, to learn from each other's mistakes or successes, and to implement better ways of working. So to act as a forum for introducing improved ways of working. So if there was a new piece of technology that could be used, or there was a new document template, or there was a spreadsheet which was helpful to manage test status and that kind of stuff. So the test manager basically corralled all the testers in that way. So it was less a more formal test management role, more a consultative role, and management of resources across multiple project teams. Next one, would you involve all team members, also known as developers, in any test phase of activity, for example, bug verification? Would you involve? I'm not entirely clear what that means, but I think the discussion of bugs within the Agile team, by and large, it's the nature of the organization and the level of trust, the level of experience that you have within the team. So I think what's being asked is, are bugs held within the team and they're not made public outside the team, or do they become more widely dispersed and captured in an incident tracking process? I have to say this. I think bugs that are exposed and fixed within the development process, by and large, need not become public outside the development team or developers themselves. The testing that testers do inside an iteration to reach the point where users then see showcases of the new versions of the software, I think, again, unless those bugs are very severe, they do not need to be discussed outside the context of the team itself. They might not involve the user at all if the nature of the bug is well understood. If the nature of the bug is significant in that it challenges the thinking of a requirement, potentially you would involve the users, and you might go outside the team to look for stakeholders who have broader experience and maybe control of the project or program as a whole. So the nature of discussion of bugs and whether you capture them in an incident management process or database, and whether you make them public or private to the team, I think depends on the nature of the bug and also the nature of the organization. If the organization doesn't need to see incidents tracked, potentially they don't need to be tracked at all. Now I can guess that some people will say, wait a minute, what about all the statistics you get out of bug reporting tools? Well, if you need those statistics, I guess you need to capture the bugs. It's as simple as that. And in the meantime, I'll thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to talk to you guys again soon. Thank you.